The December rain hammered against the windows of the Romano estate like bullets, and Dante Romano stood in his study, watching the storm consume the New York skyline with the same appetite that had consumed his soul 5 years ago. At 34, he ruled an empire built on blood and silence, the kind of power that made senators return his calls and rivals disappear into the East River, but none of it had filled the hole that opened in his chest the night he watched Aria Russo's car explode on Route 9. He'd been following her that night, planning to apologize for their fight about his family, about the darkness he brought into her life, planning to tell her he'd choose her over everything. And then the world became fire and twisted metal, and the smell of burning that still woke him screaming some nights. His father had died 2 years ago, and Dante had inherited everything: the shipping operations, the protection rackets, the political connections, the weight of a legacy built over 3 generations. But he would have traded it all to undo that moment, to save the woman who'd looked at him like he was more than his last name, more than the violence he'd been trained to deliver without hesitation. "Mr. Romano, the new maid is here." "His head of security," Vince said from the doorway, and Dante waved dismissively without turning because domestic staff were invisible to him, ghosts who cleaned the blood from his world and asked no questions. "Mrs. Chen vouched for her, said she's reliable, and—" Vince's briefing was interrupted by a voice that stopped Dante's heart mid-beat, a voice he'd heard only in dreams and nightmares for 5 years, a voice that belonged to a dead woman. "I know where everything is." Dante's whiskey glass slipped from his fingers, amber liquid spreading across Persian rugs that cost more than most people earned in a year, but he didn't notice because he was turning slowly, certain his mind had finally broken under the weight of grief and guilt, certain he was hallucinating, or dying, or both. But there she stood, Aria Russo, dead for 5 years, burned to ashes in a car explosion that had taken 3 dental records to confirm her identity, standing in his study, wearing a gray maid's uniform, and looking at him with eyes that burned with something between hatred and triumph. Her appearance had changed. The long chestnut hair he'd wrapped around his fingers in stolen moments, now cut into a severe black bob. The soft curves that had fit perfectly against him replaced by lean muscle and sharp angles. The gentle artist who'd restored paintings with reverent hands transformed into something harder, colder, dangerous. But those green eyes were unmistakable, and the way she held herself with coiled tension like a blade ready to cut, and the small scar above her left eyebrow from the time she'd laughed so hard at his terrible joke that she'd walked into a doorframe. All of it was her, impossible and real, and standing in his study like a ghost made flesh. "Aria," he managed, his voice cracking on her name like he was 18 again, instead of the feared head of the Romano crime family, and she smiled with something too sharp to be happiness, too controlled to be anything but weaponized. "Surprised?" she asked, tilting her head in a gesture he remembered from 1,000 mornings waking up beside her, except now it carried mockery instead of affection. "You look like you've seen a ghost, Dante." "Which I suppose you have, considering your family tried very hard to make sure I stayed dead." The words hit him like physical blows, each one precisely aimed to cause maximum damage, and Vince's hand moved toward his concealed weapon with the instinct of a man who'd spent 15 years protecting Romano family interests. "Sir, do you know this woman? Should I—" Vince started, but Dante raised his hand sharply, his eyes never leaving Aria's face, drinking in every detail of her survival like a man dying of thirst. "Leave us," Dante commanded, his voice carrying the authority that had sent men to kill and die without question. And Vince hesitated only a moment before retreating and closing the heavy door with a click that sounded like a cell locking. The silence stretched between them, filled with 5 years of grief and rage, and questions that multiplied faster than Dante could organize them into coherent thought. And he realized his hands were shaking, that his carefully maintained control was crumbling in the face of this impossible resurrection. How? The question came out barely above a whisper, encompassing everything. How had she survived the explosion that had vaporized her car? How had she stayed hidden for 5 years? How was she standing here now, looking at him like he was the enemy when he'd spent months hunting her killers and years grieving her loss? How did you survive? Where have you been? Why didn't you? The questions tumbled over each other, desperate and confused. And Arya's expression shifted into something that might have been pity or contempt or both. Why didn't I contact you? She finished for him, moving closer with steps that were measured and controlled. Nothing like the way she used to float through rooms like music. Why would I reach out to the family that orchestrated my murder, Dante? Why would I trust the son of the man who ordered the hit? The brother of the man who ran me off the road, the heir to an empire built on my ashes. The accusation was a knife between his ribs, twisting with surgical precision, and Dante felt the floor tilting beneath him as pieces started clicking together. His father's relief when Dante finally stopped investigating, his brother Julian's promotion shortly after the funeral, the Volkov brothers who disappeared to Chicago and never returned. I didn't know, he said, the words pathetically inadequate, but desperately true. Arya, I swear on everything. I didn't know it was them. I thought. The investigation pointed to the Castellano family. I killed 7 men looking for your murderers. But she was shaking her head, reaching into her uniform pocket with deliberate slowness, and Dante's body tensed, waiting for a gun. For this to be the revenge she'd spent 5 years planning. His death delivered by the woman he'd loved more than his own life. Instead, she withdrew a photograph, worn at the edges from repeated handling, and placed it on his desk with the care of someone presenting evidence at trial. Dante forced himself to look down and felt his world implode. His father deep in conversation with the Volkov brothers, the timestamp reading December 15th, 5 years ago. One day before Arya's car had exploded into flames that still burned behind Dante's eyelids when he closed his eyes. Surprised I survived your family's attack? Arya asked, her voice soft as silk and lethal as poison. And she turned slightly so he could see the way her uniform pulled oddly across her left shoulder, the telltale stiffness of extensive burn scars hidden beneath fabric. Because I barely did. The explosion threw me clear before the main charge detonated, and I crawled half a mile through snow, while your brother probably celebrated a job well done. A trucker found me hypothermic and nearly dead. And I spent 3 months healing in a veterinarian's clinic, because hospitals would have reported me, and your family would have finished what they started. What would you do if someone you thought was dead came back seeking answers? Would you be ready to face the truth about the people you love? Dante's mind spun through 5 years of lies, through every assumption he'd built about that night, unraveling like thread pulled from a tapestry, and he had to grip the edge of his desk to stay upright, because the foundation of his grief was cracking, and beneath it was something much worse. Complicity, betrayal, the realization that the family he'd bled for had murdered the only person who'd ever made him want to be something other than his father's weapon. When did you know? He asked hoarsely, needing to understand the timeline of her pain. When tragedy had transformed into something calculated and cold. When did you realize it was my family and not just some random attack? Arya's hand traced the edge of the photograph like it was sacred text. Evidence that had sustained her through whatever hell she'd walked through to get back here. 6 months after, she said, her voice taking on the flat quality of someone reciting facts to maintain distance from emotion. I was working in a Philadelphia diner under a fake name, trying to figure out how to survive on minimum wage and fear. One of the Volkov brothers' associates came in drunk, bragging to impress his date about a job they'd done for the Romano family, about burning some boss's girlfriend so completely They needed dental records for identification. Her fingers tightened on the photograph until her knuckles went white. He described your father's orders, Julian's role in running me off the road, every detail of how they'd planned it. I served him coffee with a smile while he laughed about murdering me. The image of Arya standing there serving her own killer, maintaining composure while her world collapsed again, was almost incomprehensible in its cruelty. What did you do? Dante asked, though part of him already knew the answer, could see it in the hard set of her jaw and the calculating coldness in her eyes that hadn't been there 5 years ago, when she'd been an art restorer who believed in beauty and redemption. I poisoned his coffee with antifreeze, Arya said simply, without remorse or hesitation. He died 2 days later in agony while his organs shut down. That's when I knew survival wasn't enough anymore. I had to come back, had to make everyone involved pay for what they took from me. She moved around his desk now, invading his space, and Dante could smell her different perfume with notes of smoke and steel, could see the small scars on her hands that spoke of violence and training, could recognize that the girl he'd loved had been forged into something entirely new in the fires his family had set. Do you know what I've been doing for 3 years, Dante? I've been working for the Byrne family, feeding them intelligence about your operations, helping them understand your weaknesses. Every shipment you've lost, every deal that fell through, every soldier who ended up dead, that was me, helping them hurt you the way your family hurt me. The confession should have triggered rage, should have activated every instinct to protect the empire he'd inherited. But Dante felt only a sick understanding that he deserved this, that they all deserved whatever she'd planned. Why tell me now? He managed, genuinely confused by her strategy. Why reveal yourself when you could have stayed hidden, kept destroying me from the shadows? Arya stopped her circling, standing close enough that he could see the gold flecks in her green eyes, close enough to touch if he dared. Because I needed to look you in the eyes and know if you were part of it, she said quietly. And for the first time he heard something beneath the fury that sounded like the girl he'd loved. For 2 years, I've been planning this, building my case, preparing to destroy everyone involved. But the one thing I couldn't confirm was whether you knew. Whether you'd been complicit in trying to kill me, or if you were just another victim of your family's choices. Her hand came up to rest against his chest, right over his heart, feeling it pound against her palm. And now that I've seen your face, seen your shock, I know you didn't know. That you've been living in the same hell I have, just with different information. The door burst open, and Julian Romano strode in with the aggressive confidence of someone who'd never learned to knock. Dante's younger brother carrying himself like he owned whatever room he entered. His expensive suit and arrogant smile the uniform of a man who'd never faced real consequences for anything. We need to talk about the Byrne situation, Julian said, his eyes dismissing Arya immediately as hired help, as invisible as all domestic staff were to men like them. They hit another shipment and knew exactly which truck to target. We've got a leak somewhere, and I want authorization to start questioning the crew with whatever methods necessary to... He stopped mid-sentence as his eyes finally registered Arya properly, really seeing her face instead of just the uniform. And Dante watched recognition and shock and fear cycle across his brother's features in rapid succession. You, Julian breathed, his hand moving automatically toward his concealed weapon. You're supposed to be dead. I watched your car burn, made sure there was nothing left, but... The confession spilled out before Julian could stop it. Confirmation from his own mouth that he'd been involved, that he'd tried to murder her and thought he'd succeeded. Arya smiled at Julian with the serene calm of someone holding all the cards, someone who'd spent 5 years preparing for exactly this moment. Surprise, she said sweetly. I survived your family's attack. Funny how things work out sometimes. Julian's gun cleared his holster smoothly, but Dante was already moving, stepping between his brother and Arya with his body as a shield, the Beretta's barrel pressing against his chest, while Julian's eyes went wide with shock and fury. "Move, Dante," Julian commanded, his finger on the trigger. "That woman is a threat to everything Father built, everything we are. She needs to disappear permanently, and you're protecting her. Have you lost your mind?" The accusation carried the weight of their entire upbringing. Every lesson their father had beaten into them about family loyalty being absolute, about nothing mattering more than the Romano name and legacy. "Lower the gun," Dante said quietly, his voice carrying an edge of violence that made even Julian hesitate. "You tried to kill her because Father ordered it, because she made me happy, because loving her made me question whether this life was worth living. You murdered an innocent woman and let me grieve her for 5 years, while you got promoted and rewarded for destroying the only good thing I ever had." The rage that had been building since Arya walked into his study was finding its target. 5 years of misdirected fury, finally aimed at the right people. "I loved you," Dante said, looking past Julian to Arya, needing her to hear it even though the timing was terrible. "I still love you, and I will spend whatever time I have left making this right, making them pay for what they took from us." The declaration hung in the air like a grenade, and Julian's face twisted with contempt and something that might have been jealousy or vindication. "Father was right about her making you weak," Julian spat, but he lowered the gun slightly, calculating odds and outcomes. "You're choosing her over family, over everything we've built. You know what happens to traitors, Dante." The threat was clear, and Arya laughed, the sound sharp enough to cut. "Oh, Julian, you're not in a position to threaten anyone," she said, pulling out her phone and swiping to a video that she played on speaker. Their father's voice filled the study, recorded years ago, giving explicit orders to eliminate Arya, to make it look like an accident, to help Dante become harder by breaking his heart. The evidence was damning, and Julian's face went pale as he realized she had proof, had documentation, had spent years gathering ammunition for this exact confrontation. "I have recordings of every major crime your family has committed for the last 20 years. Arya continued, her voice steady and confident as she faced both brothers. "Your father kept insurance files on everyone. Politicians, judges, captains, soldiers. He documented everything in case he needed leverage or protection, and I found his safe 6 months ago when I was working here as part of the overnight cleaning crew." She looked directly at Dante, and he saw something in her expression that might have been sympathy or cruelty. He had it hidden behind the Monet in his office, the one he stole from the Gardner Museum heist. "You didn't even know it existed, did you?" "He never trusted you with the location of his deepest secrets." The revelation was another cut, another reminder that despite inheriting the empire, Dante had never possessed his father's full confidence, had always been the son who needed to prove himself worthy of a legacy built on bones and blood. Julian's gun hand was shaking now, rage and fear fighting for dominance in his expression, and Dante could see his brother calculating whether he could shoot them both and somehow contain the damage, whether violence could solve a problem that had already metastasized beyond the reach of bullets. "You're bluffing," Julian said, but his voice lacked conviction. "You don't have the connections to leverage that kind of—" Arya cut him off by making a call on speaker, and a professional male voice answered on the second ring. "Agent Crawford?" "FBI Organized Crime Division," the voice said, and Dante felt the floor drop out from under him as implications cascaded through his mind like falling dominoes. "Claire, is everything all right? You weren't supposed to check in until Friday." The familiarity in the agent's tone suggested regular contact, ongoing cooperation, a relationship built over months or years of her feeding information to federal investigators. Everything's fine, Agent Crawford, Arya said, using what must have been one of her aliases. Her eyes locked on Julian's face as she delivered the killing blow. Just confirming you received the latest batch of files I sent over. The recordings about the port authority bribes and the Castellano hit from 3 years ago. There was typing on the other end, the sound of someone accessing digital files. Received and logged into evidence, Crawford confirmed. The U.S. attorney is very interested in these recordings. We're building quite a case here. When you're ready to testify, we'll have enough to dismantle the entire Romano operation and put everyone involved away for life. Arya let the words hang in the air for a long moment, watching Julian's face cycle through shock and rage, and the dawning realization that he was cornered, that the Empire was collapsing and there was no way to stop it. I'll be in touch, she said sweetly and ended the call. You're a federal informant, Julian said, the words almost awed in their horror, because in their world there was no greater betrayal, no worse crime than cooperating with law enforcement. You've been feeding the FBI evidence against us, building a case. And you! He turned to Dante with accusatory fury. You're protecting her? She's trying to destroy everything Father built, everything we are, and you're choosing her over family. The question demanded an answer, required Dante to declare loyalty one way or the other, to choose between the legacy he'd inherited and the woman who'd returned from the dead seeking justice. Dante looked at Arya, really looked at her, seeing the scars she carried both visible and hidden, understanding the years of pain and planning she'd endured, recognizing that his family had earned whatever destruction she brought, and made the choice that would define the rest of his life. Yes, Dante said simply, the word final and irreversible. I'm choosing her over all of it. Father was a monster who ordered the murder of an innocent woman, 'cause she made me happy. You're a killer who ran her off the road and tried to burn her alive. The captains and soldiers have built their fortunes on violence and suffering. If she's bringing it all down, if she's making you pay for your crimes. He stepped closer to Julian, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper. Then I'm going to help her do it, because it's the first right thing I'll have done in my entire life. Julian's face flushed with rage and betrayal, the gun coming back up to point at Dante's chest, and for a moment the study was balanced on the knife's edge of violence, everything about to explode into bloodshed and chaos. If you pull that trigger, Arya said calmly, drawing Julian's attention back to her. Agent Crawford gets a Dead Man's Switch email containing video evidence of you confessing to my attempted murder, along with documentation of 15 other crimes. You'll be arrested before my body goes cold, and you'll spend the rest of your life in a federal supermax prison. So ask yourself, Julian, is killing your traitor brother worth throwing away any chance you have of beating this? The mathematics of the situation were elegant and brutal, every angle covered, every escape route blocked, and Dante recognized the precision of someone who'd spent years planning this moment, who'd thought through every possible response and prepared countermeasures for all of them. Julian lowered the gun slowly, his face twisted with impotent rage, and Dante could see his brother's mind working through scenarios, trying to find a play that didn't end with his destruction. This isn't over, Julian promised, backing toward the door with the cautious movement of someone retreating from predators. The family won't accept this. The captains won't follow you when they know you're compromised by a federal witness. You're both dead. You just don't know it yet. He yanked open the door and left, his footsteps echoing down the hallway. And then Dante and Arya were alone in the study, with the weight of what had just happened settling over them like fallout. Dante turned to face her fully, this woman who'd been dead and was now alive, who'd spent 5 years becoming a weapon sharp enough to destroy his entire world, who was offering him a choice between everything he'd known and something he couldn't quite see, but desperately wanted to believe in. "What happens now?" he asked, his voice rough with emotion he'd been suppressing since the moment she'd walked back into his life. Arya stepped closer, and Dante could see the vulnerability beneath her armor now, the fear hiding under her confidence. The girl he'd loved still existing somewhere inside the warrior she'd become. "Now you have a choice," she said quietly. "You can try to protect your family, warn them about the FBI investigation, maintain the Romano legacy and everything it represents. Or..." She paused, and her hand came up to rest against his chest again, feeling his heart racing beneath her palm. "Or you can help me finish this. Help me make sure everyone who was involved in trying to kill me faces justice. Help me burn down the empire that was built on my ashes. And then maybe..." Her voice caught slightly, the first real crack in her composure. "Maybe we can figure out if there's anything left of us worth saving." The choice she offered was impossible and clear, and Dante knew that saying yes meant betraying everything he'd been raised to value, turning against his own blood, destroying the legacy 3 generations had built. But looking at Arya, seeing the scars his family had given her, understanding the hell she'd survived, recognizing that she was offering him redemption disguised as cooperation, he realized there was no choice at all, that the decision had been made the moment his father had ordered her death. That choosing her now was simply finishing what he should have done 5 years ago when he'd loved her but hadn't loved her enough. "Tell me what you need me to do," Dante said, and watched something that looked like relief and hope and cautious trust flicker across Arya's face as she began to explain exactly how they would dismantle the Romano Empire together. Over the next 72 hours, Dante's world transformed from the ordered hierarchy he'd always known into something that felt like standing on shifting sand while watching everything he'd built sink into darkness. Arya remained at the estate playing her role as maid during daylight hours, when other staff moved through the mansion, her performance so convincing that no one questioned the woman scrubbing floors and changing linens. But at night, after the house settled into silence, she became something else entirely, a strategist laying out the architecture of the Romano family's destruction with the precision of a surgeon planning where to cut. They worked in his study with the door locked and security cameras looped with old footage, spreading documents across his desk that painted a comprehensive picture of 3 generations of criminal enterprise, every vulnerability mapped and analyzed, and ready to be exploited. Dante found himself simultaneously horrified by the scope of his family's crimes and impressed by the depth of Arya's preparation, the years of patient intelligence gathering that had produced this devastating portrait of everything his grandfather and father and now he had built in suffering. "The port operations are your primary revenue stream," Arya explained on the second night, her finger tracing shipping routes on maps that showed Romano influence from Boston to Miami. "You control Pier 17 through bribes to Councilman Rizzo, who takes your money and also takes money from the Calabrese family for the same service at Pier 23. If evidence of his double dealing reached both families simultaneously, if they both believed he was working exclusively for their enemies." She looked up at Dante with eyes that gleamed with dark intelligence. "He becomes a liability everyone wants eliminated, and without him protecting your shipments, the entire import operation collapses within weeks. The elegance of it was terrible, using the Romano family's own methods against them, turning paranoia and violence into weapons that would tear the organization apart from inside." Dante studied the documents and saw his empire as Arya saw it, not as the inevitable legacy his father had claimed, but as a house of cards held together by fear and bribes and violence, ready to collapse if the right pressure was applied to the right structural weaknesses. "You've thought of everything," Dante said quietly, looking at her across the desk where they'd spread the evidence of his family's sins like autopsy photographs. 3 years of this, building the case piece by piece, learning our systems well enough to know exactly where to strike. Arya's expression softened slightly, exhaustion showing through the armor she maintained during waking hours. "Some nights I wanted to give up, she admitted, her voice losing its hard edge. Disappear to somewhere warm and far away. Let the past stay buried and just try to build a normal life. But then I'd remember the explosion, the burning, crawling through snow while my skin was still smoking. Her hand unconsciously went to her left shoulder where the scars were hidden beneath her clothing. And I'd keep working, keep planning, because the idea of them never paying for what they did was worse than any exhaustion. The detail about her skin smoking made Dante's stomach turn. One more horrific image to add to the collection that haunted him whenever he closed his eyes. I looked for who did it, he said, the confession feeling like pulling out his own fingernails. For months after you died, after I thought you died, I tortured men for information they didn't have about a crime my own family committed. Joey Castellano died screaming in his restaurant because I was so certain his crew was responsible. The memory tasted like bile and failure. I killed the wrong people while the actual murderers were sitting at my family dinner table, and I was too blind to see it. Arya reached across the desk and took his hand, the gesture surprising them both, her scarred palm pressing against his and sending electricity through his nervous system that felt like coming back to life after years of numbness. You didn't know, she said gently. Your father was good at lying, at manipulating, at making you see what he wanted you to see. That's what men like him do. They control the narrative, shape reality to serve their purposes, and punish anyone who questions the story they're telling. Her thumb traced small circles on his palm, and Dante wondered if she even realized she was doing it. If the gesture was conscious choice, or muscle memory from when they'd been together, and touch had been their primary language. But you know now. You're choosing differently now. That matters, Dante. It doesn't erase what happened, but it matters. The forgiveness in her voice was tentative and precious, something he hadn't dared hope for when she'd first revealed herself, and he found himself holding onto her hand like it was the only thing keeping him anchored to something real and good. If we do this, Dante said slowly, working through implications he'd been avoiding. If we follow through with destroying the family operations and cooperating with Agent Crawford, Julian will come after us. Not just legally or politically, but with everything he has. He'll see it as existential threat and respond with the only language he knows. The reality of his brother's capacity for violence sat between them heavy and undeniable, a threat that couldn't be negotiated or reasoned with. Arya's hand tightened on his, and when she spoke her voice carried steel underneath the softness. I've survived one attempt on my life already. I've spent 5 years learning to fight, to shoot, to never be the helpless victim your family tried to make me. If Julian comes for me, her green eyes met his with absolute certainty. I'll be ready this time, and he won't find it nearly as easy as running an unarmed art restorer off a dark road. The transformation in her was stunning and sad. This woman who'd once believed in beauty and creation, now forced to become someone who thought in terms of violence and survival. And Dante felt the weight of his family's responsibility for the change, like stones in his chest. I won't let him hurt you again, Dante promised, meaning it with every fiber of his being. Whatever it takes, whatever I have to do, he won't touch you. Arya smiled, but it was tinged with sorrow. That's what you said 5 years ago, that you'd protect me, that your family wouldn't be a problem for us. But loving you was dangerous then, and it's dangerous now, Dante. The difference is now I understand the cost, and I'm choosing to pay it anyway. The confession hung between them, loaded with meaning, with the acknowledgement that despite everything, the murder attempt, the 5 years of suffering, the betrayal and lies, something between them had survived, complicated and damaged, but still present, still pulling them together like gravity. Before Dante could respond, his phone buzzed with an incoming message from one of his captains, the text brief and urgent. Emergency meeting called. Julian summoning all leadership. Says there's a threat to family security that requires immediate vote. Tomorrow night, Delancey Warehouse. Dante showed the message to Arya and watched her expression shift from soft to sharp strategic mind, already analyzing angles and threats. He's making his move, she said, standing and pacing the study with contained energy, calling the captains together to vote you out, to declare you compromised and unfit to lead. If he gets majority support, she didn't need to finish the sentence because they both knew what happened to deposed Romano leaders, how family disputes were settled with bullets rather than ballots, how loyalty was enforced through fear of what happened to traitors. I have to go, Dante said, already planning his approach, thinking through which captains might support him and which had always been Julian's allies. If I don't show, it's the same as admitting weakness, confirming everything Julian will tell them about me being compromised by you. Arya stopped her pacing and turned to face him with fear in her eyes, real terror breaking through her controlled facade. It's a trap. He'll either convince them to kill you, or he'll do it himself and claim it was necessary to protect the family. You can't walk into that warehouse, Dante. But he was already shaking his head because running wasn't an option, because leadership meant facing threats directly, because in his world, showing fear was invitation for violence. I have to face them, have to make my case before Julian controls the narrative completely, Dante insisted. But you need to disappear, get somewhere safe, somewhere Julian can't reach you if this goes wrong. Arya crossed the distance between them in 3 quick steps, her hands coming up to grip his shirt with surprising strength, pulling him down until they were eye level and he could see the gold flecks in her green eyes and smell her different perfume and feel her breath against his face. No, she said firmly. I didn't spend 5 years preparing for this just to run when things get dangerous. If you're going to that meeting, if you're going to face your family and choose me over their legacy, then I'm going to be there to make sure you survive it. The determination in her voice was absolute, and Dante recognized that arguing would be useless, that she'd made her choice the same way he'd made his, that they were committed now to seeing this through together no matter the cost. Then we go together, Dante said, his hands coming up to cup her face, feeling the warmth of her skin and the slight tremble that betrayed her fear underneath the bravado. We face them together. Tell the truth about what Father and Julian did. Let the captains decide if they want to follow a legacy built on murdering innocent women, or if they're ready for something different. It was naive, probably, hopeful in ways that would have made his father laugh with contempt. But looking at Arya, seeing the scars his family had given her and the strength she'd forged from suffering, Dante found himself believing that maybe truth was stronger than lies. That maybe love could survive in soil fertilized by violence. That maybe they could burn down the empire and build something better from the ashes. Arya pulled him closer until their foreheads touched, and they stood like that, breathing the same air, while outside the study, the Romano estate continued its usual operations, unaware that everything was about to change, that the empire was crumbling, and the old order was dying, and something new was being born in the space between a dead girl and the man who'd loved her enough to betray everything for one more chance at getting it right. The Delancey warehouse sat in the industrial heart of Romano territory, a converted space where family business had been conducted for 40 years. Where disputes were settled and decisions ratified, and sometimes where bodies were wrapped in plastic before disappearing into the East River. Dante arrived with Vince and Arya, deliberately keeping his security minimal to avoid appearing paranoid or aggressive, though every instinct screamed that walking into this meeting was walking into an ambush designed to end with his blood on concrete. The 8 captains were already seated around the long table when they entered, faces carefully neutral in the way of men trying not to telegraph their positions before understanding the full situation, and Julian stood at the head wearing their father's ring and a smile that promised violence. Brother, Julian said with false warmth, that fooled no one. I'm glad you came and you brought our guest. How thoughtful. His eyes tracked to Aria with predatory interest, and Dante felt rage rising hot in his chest at the way Julian looked at her like she was prey, like unfinished business from 5 years ago. You called this meeting, Dante said, taking his seat at the opposite end of the table, in the position that had been his since inheriting leadership, refusing to cede ground even symbolically. You told the captains there was a threat to family security. So explain what threat you're talking about, Julian, and let's see if they agree with your assessment. The challenge was direct, and Julian's smile widened, because this was exactly what he wanted. The confrontation in front of witnesses where Dante's choices could be judged and condemned by men who valued loyalty to family above everything else. The threat is standing right behind you, Julian said, gesturing to Aria with theatrical contempt. That woman is Aria Russo, Dante's former girlfriend, who was supposed to have died 5 years ago in a tragic accident. Except she didn't die. She survived and spent the intervening years working with the FBI, gathering evidence against our family, feeding intelligence to our enemies, specifically the Byrne organization that's been bleeding our operations for the last 18 months. The murmurs around the table were immediate, captains exchanging glances and reaching subtle conclusions, hands moving closer to weapons as the threat assessment changed from abstract to concrete. Salvatore Russo, the oldest captain, and a man who'd served under Dante's grandfather, leaned forward with narrowed eyes. Is this true? You brought a federal informant into the estate, into our operations, knowing she was working against us. The question was aimed at Dante, but the accusation was clear. The implication that his judgment was compromised by emotion, that he'd put personal feelings above family security. Dante stood slowly, commanding the room's attention, knowing this was his only chance to control the narrative before Julian buried him under accusations he couldn't refute. It's true that Aria survived, Dante said clearly. It's true she's been gathering evidence against us. What Julian conveniently left out is why she survived, why she spent 5 years preparing to destroy our family, because Father ordered her killed, and Julian carried out the hit. The silence that followed was absolute, shock rippling through the assembled captains like a shockwave. Because attempted murder of civilians wasn't unusual in their world. But this was different. This was the boss ordering a hit on his own son's girlfriend for the crime of making him happy. That's a lie, Julian said, but his voice lacked conviction, and Dante could see some of the captains looking at his brother with new assessment, with suspicion dawning. Father would never... But Aria stepped forward then, pulling out her phone and playing the recording of their father's voice, giving explicit orders to eliminate her, to make it look like an accident, to break Dante by destroying what he loved, and the dead man's words filled the warehouse with undeniable evidence of conspiracy and murder. Your father decided I was a distraction, Aria said, her voice steady as she addressed the captains directly. He ordered Julian to run me off the road, and the Volkov brothers to rig my car with explosives. I survived by chance and luck, crawled through snow while my skin was still burning, and spent 5 years learning everything I needed to know to make sure everyone involved paid for what they did. The revelation shifted the dynamics in the room. Captains who'd been ready to condemn Dante now looking uncertain, their moral calculus disrupted by evidence that the old boss had ordered the hit. That family leadership had murdered an innocent woman for strategic purposes that seemed increasingly indefensible under scrutiny. Even if that's true, Julian said, recovering quickly, she's still a federal informant who's been working to destroy us. She admitted to helping the Byrnes, to feeding them intelligence. Dante's been protecting her, cooperating with her, probably helping her build the FBI's case. He's chosen her over family, over everything Father built, and you all know what we do to traitors. The word hung in the air like a noose. the ultimate condemnation in their world. And Dante saw several captains nodding, because regardless of motivation, cooperation with federal authorities was the unforgivable sin that demanded blood response. "I'm choosing truth over lies," Dante said, his voice gaining strength. "I'm choosing to look at what we actually are. Instead of the story Father told us about honor and family and legacy, we're criminals. We hurt people for profit. We bribe and extort and kill, and we pretend it's acceptable because we follow codes and respect hierarchies. But at the end of the day, we're just men who've built fortunes on other people's suffering." The confession was radical in its honesty, stripping away the pretense that made their violence palatable. And he saw shock on several faces because Romano leaders didn't talk like this, didn't question the fundamental righteousness of what they did. "Father ordered an innocent woman murdered to make me harder, to make me more like him. And you all just accepted it, because that's what we do. We accept that nothing matters more than the family, that any cruelty can be justified if it serves our interests." Before anyone could respond, the warehouse doors exploded inward with the crash of battering rams and the coordinated chaos of federal agents in tactical gear pouring through every entrance. Rifles raised, and voices shouting commands to get hands up and nobody move. Dante's heart stopped as he realized what was happening. This wasn't Julian's trap. It was Aria's. She'd orchestrated this moment to gather all the Romano leadership in one location where the FBI could arrest them simultaneously, could dismantle the entire organizational structure in a single coordinated raid. Agent Crawford appeared flanked by a dozen armed officers, his eyes finding Aria immediately with the familiarity of someone who'd been coordinating with her for years. "Gentlemen, you're all under arrest," Crawford announced with professional satisfaction. "Racketeering, murder, conspiracy, and about 20 other charges we'll detail at the federal building. This operation is over." Dante felt betrayal crash through him like a tidal wave, understanding that every moment in his study had been performance, that Aria had used his guilt and love to position him exactly where she needed him, had manipulated him into gathering his family's leadership for capture. She'd played him perfectly, had offered redemption and partnership while actually preparing to destroy him, along with everyone else. And the pain of that realization was somehow worse than watching her car explode 5 years ago, because at least then he believed she'd loved him. At least then he hadn't known that love could be weaponized with such devastating precision. Their eyes met across the warehouse, and Dante searched her face for any sign of regret, any indication that the vulnerability she'd shown him had been real. But all he saw was cold determination and the satisfaction of a plan executed flawlessly. Justice served with surgical precision. "Aria," he said, his voice breaking on her name, needing to understand if any of it had been real, or if he'd been nothing but a tool she'd used to complete her revenge. She looked at him for a long moment, her expression unreadable, and then she turned away to confer with Agent Crawford while federal agents swarmed the captains and began the process of arrests and Miranda warnings. Dante felt hands on his arms pulling them behind his back, felt the cold metal of handcuffs closing around his wrists, felt his entire world collapsing for the second time because of the same woman, and he realized that maybe this was justice. Maybe this was what he deserved for being born into the Romano family and inheriting their legacy of violence. Maybe love had never been possible for someone like him, and he'd been foolish to hope otherwise. Julian was shouting threats and curses. Other captains were being forced to the ground. Vince was watching Dante with something like pity. And through it all, Aria stood with the FBI agents, looking like she belonged there, looking like she'd finally found her people after 5 years of being alone. And Dante understood that he'd lost her twice now, once to his family's violence, and once to his own naive belief that he could somehow make things right just by choosing her. The federal holding cell was cold concrete and fluorescent lights that hummed like dying insects, and Dante sat on the metal bench, trying to process how completely Arya had destroyed him, while Agent Crawford's footsteps echoed in the corridor outside. They'd separated him from the other captains, isolated him because cooperation witnesses couldn't mix with the people they were testifying against, though Dante hadn't agreed to cooperate with anything, hadn't spoken a word since the handcuffs had closed around his wrists in the warehouse. 12 hours had passed in silence, 12 hours of replaying every moment with Arya, and trying to identify which parts had been real and which had been performance. Trying to understand if she'd ever actually considered forgiving him, or if the entire thing had been elaborate theater designed to position him for exactly this outcome. The cell door opened, and Arya walked in, still wearing the FBI windbreaker, her face uncertain in ways it hadn't been during the raid, and Dante felt his heart twist painfully because even now, even knowing she'd betrayed him, he couldn't stop loving her and hating himself for that weakness. "I came to explain," she said quietly, staying near the door like she expected him to attack, or maybe hoped he would, violence being simpler than the complicated truth. "Before the lawyers and prosecutors turn everything into strategy, I wanted you to hear it from me." Dante laughed, the sound bitter and broken. "Explain what, Arya? That you used me perfectly? That every vulnerable moment in my study was calculated manipulation? That you offered me redemption while actually preparing to destroy me along with everyone else?" The accusation spilled out raw and hurt, and he saw her flinch, but couldn't find satisfaction in causing her pain, because his own was too overwhelming. "I've been working with Agent Crawford for 2 years," Arya admitted, moving closer, but maintaining careful distance. "Building the case, gathering evidence, planning the raid. Everything I told you about wanting revenge was true, about needing everyone involved to pay for trying to kill me. But," she paused, her hands trembling slightly, "what I didn't expect was looking in your eyes and knowing you hadn't been part of it, that you'd been grieving me for 5 years, that your shock was real." "Then why the raid?" Dante demanded, standing to face her, needing to understand the logic that had led to his arrest. "If you knew I was innocent of trying to kill you, why let me get swept up with the others?" Arya's eyes filled with tears she tried to blink back. "Because you're still guilty of everything else, Dante. The murders you ordered, the violence you sanctioned, the empire you maintained for 2 years after inheriting it. You killed Joey Castellano and 6 others looking for my murderer, and those deaths are on your hands regardless of your motivation. You're not innocent just because you didn't know about one specific crime." The truth of it was undeniable and crushing, confirmation that love didn't absolve him of responsibility for the life he'd chosen, the legacy he'd accepted, the violence he'd committed in the name of family and grief and misdirected rage. "So what now?" Dante asked, exhaustion replacing anger because fury required energy he no longer possessed. "I go to trial, get convicted, spend the rest of my life in federal prison for being my father's son." Arya pulled a folder from her jacket and placed it on the bench between them. "Agent Crawford authorized me to offer you a deal. Full cooperation, testimony against Julian and the captains, details about the organization's structure, evidence about unsolved murders. In exchange, witness protection, immunity from prosecution for crimes you testify about, a chance to disappear and build a new life." The offer hung in the air like salvation and damnation combined, survival purchased through betrayal, freedom bought by destroying what remained of his family. "You want me to become an informant," Dante said flatly, understanding the price she was asking him to pay. "Turn against my brother, against men who've bled for the Romano family, send them all to prison to save myself." Arya stepped closer, her hand reaching out to touch his arm. "I want you to tell the truth and stop protecting people who ordered an innocent woman murdered. I want you to choose justice over loyalty to criminals. I want," her voice broke, "I want us both to survive this, Dante. I want us to both get out and maybe, if there's anything left worth saving between us, Figure out how to build something from the ashes. The confession landed like a bomb, revealing that beneath the FBI cooperation and calculated manipulation was something that looked like hope, like forgiveness, like the possibility that she hadn't just used him, but actually still loved him despite everything. If I cooperate, Dante said slowly, if I testify and disappear into witness protection, would you come with me? Is that what you're offering? The question felt too large for the small cell, too important to ask without knowing he could survive the answer. Yes, Arya said simply, tears falling freely now. We start over somewhere new, become different people, leave all of this behind, and see if we can be who we were supposed to be before your family and violence and all of this got in the way. Dante looked at the folder, at the woman offering him salvation, at the choice between dying in prison as a Romano or living free as someone new, and felt the weight of legacy finally lifting because maybe his father's empire wasn't worth preserving. Maybe family loyalty was just another lie to justify cruelty. Maybe love was worth any betrayal required to keep it alive. Before he could answer, Agent Crawford appeared at the cell door with an expression that made Dante's blood run cold. We have a problem, Crawford said grimly. Julian made bail 2 hours ago. Judge Hendricks set it at $2 million, and his lawyers posted immediately using offshore accounts. He's in the wind, and given what happened at the warehouse. Crawford looked at Arya with genuine concern. We have to assume you're his primary target. We're moving you to a safe house immediately. The implications crashed through Dante like artillery. Julian was free, was motivated by both revenge and survival instinct, would come after Arya to eliminate the witness who could destroy him, and to punish Dante for choosing her over family. I'm going with her, Dante said immediately. But Crawford was already shaking his head because federal witnesses in custody didn't get to dictate security arrangements, didn't get to protect the people they loved when they were locked in cells awaiting cooperation agreements. You stay here where it's secure, Crawford said firmly. We'll keep Arya safe. Get her to the New Jersey safe house with armed protection. Julian won't get near her. But even as the agent spoke, Dante saw doubt in his eyes. Saw the recognition that Julian had resources and connections, and nothing left to lose. That federal protection was theory that hadn't been tested against someone willing to burn everything for revenge. Arya was being pulled toward the door, her eyes locked on Dante's face, and he saw fear there, beneath her composure. Saw the girl who'd already been murdered once by his family facing the prospect of Julian finishing what he'd started 5 years ago. I'll find you, Dante promised desperately. Whatever happens, wherever they take you, I'll find you and I'll keep you safe this time. The words felt useless against the reality of locked doors and federal custody. But Arya nodded like she believed him or needed to, and then she was gone. And Dante was alone with the terrible certainty that history was repeating, that loving him was a death sentence, that he was going to lose her again, and this time there would be no resurrection, no second chances, no hope of redemption through cooperation or love or anything, except the crushing weight of knowing he'd failed to protect her twice. 48 hours passed with no word from Crawford's team, no updates on Arya's location or status. Just silence that felt like standing on the edge of a cliff waiting to fall. And Dante was going insane in the holding cell, imagining every terrible thing Julian could be doing to her while he sat powerless behind locked doors. He'd given the FBI everything: names, locations, evidence about Romano operations. Full cooperation purchased with the desperate hope that making himself valuable would give him leverage to protect Arya. But Crawford kept saying the same useless platitudes about how they had their best people looking, how the safe house was secure, how Julian wouldn't get near her. Then on the third morning, Vince appeared flanked by federal agents, his former head of security looking like he'd aged a decade. And Dante's heart seized because Vince being here meant something had gone catastrophically wrong. I know where Julian took her, Vince said without preamble, his voice carrying disgust and shame. The safe house was hit yesterday morning. 2 agents down. Aria's gone. I've been hearing things from guys still loyal to your brother, guys who think I'm on their side because I haven't flipped yet. They're bragging about what Julian's got planned, where he's holding her. He pulled out a tablet showing a map with the old Romano meat processing plant in Red Hook marked in red. And Dante felt sick understanding flooding through him because that building had been used for disposal, for making problems disappear permanently, for violence that left no evidence except what went into the industrial grinders. Julian's planning to kill her tonight. Make a video of it to send to you as punishment for cooperating, then destroy the body. But he's taking his time with her first because... Vince's voice dropped. He's enjoying it, boss. Your brother's completely unraveled, and she's paying the price. Crawford was already mobilizing tactical teams, but Dante was shaking his head, because 90 minutes to coordinate SWAT and establish perimeter would give Julian time to see them coming, time to kill Aria and run, or use her as a hostage, time to finish what he'd started 5 years ago. I go in first, Dante said, the plan forming with desperate clarity. Julian wants me to recant my testimony, wants me crawling back to beg for her life. So I do that. I walk in unarmed, tell him I'll withdraw my cooperation, give him what he wants. While he's focused on me, gloating about his victory, your teams move into position and breach. Crawford objected with professional concerns about witness safety and operational protocol. But Vince supported the strategy because he knew Julian's psychology, knew that ego and need to prove superiority would make him talk instead of shooting immediately, would buy precious minutes for federal agents to surround the building. You wear a wire and follow my instructions exactly. Crawford finally agreed with obvious reluctance. The second things go wrong, you hit the ground and let SWAT handle it. Within the hour, Dante was fitted with a nearly invisible wire and riding toward Red Hook in an unmarked vehicle, watching the city slide past while his heart hammered against his ribs with fear and determination and the absolute conviction that he would save Aria this time or die trying, that there were no other acceptable outcomes. His phone buzzed with a message from Julian's number, a photo of Aria bound to a chair with fresh bruises and blood at her temple. Defiant fury still burning in her green eyes despite obvious pain, and beneath the image, come alone and unarmed, brother. Let's see if she's worth your life. Dante approached the processing plant alone as instructed, hands visible and empty, and Julian's soldiers met him at the entrance with efficient pat-downs that found no weapons because he'd come exactly as demanded, offering surrender for the slim chance it might save her. They walked him through silent machinery and hanging meat hooks deeper into the building until he reached the main floor where Julian stood behind Aria's chair, with manic energy radiating off him like fever. A gun pressed casually against her head, while she watched Dante with eyes that communicated both warning and love. I knew you'd come, Julian said with savage satisfaction. Knew that weakness would drag you here like always. Father was right about her destroying you. Dante forced himself to speak calmly, despite rage and terror. I'll recant everything, destroy the FBI's case, take all the charges myself. Just let her go, Julian, please. The begging cost him everything, but bought seconds while Crawford's teams moved into position, while snipers found angles and tactical units prepared to breach, while the wire transmitted every word and gave federal agents real-time intelligence about the building's interior. Julian circled Aria like a predator, touching her in ways designed to provoke Dante, explaining how he didn't need the recantation anymore because his lawyers said the case was falling apart, how this was just about revenge now, about making Dante watch her die and live with that failure forever. But then Arya moved, a sudden violent twist that caught Julian off guard, her head snapping back into his groin, while her hands came free from ropes she'd been working loose for hours, and she was fighting with the skills 5 years of survival training had taught her, going for Julian's throat with murder in her eyes. What would you sacrifice to save someone you love? Would you trade your freedom, your life, everything you have for one more chance to protect them? Dante launched himself forward as Arya fought Julian, tackling the nearest soldier and using the man's momentum to drive him into the concrete floor with bone-breaking force. Every lesson his father had taught him about controlled violence channeled into desperate survival instinct, because he would not watch her die again, would not fail to protect her when it mattered most. The gun clattered from Julian's grip as Arya's elbow connected with his solar plexus, and she was screaming with rage and pain and 5 years of concentrated fury, her hands clawing for his eyes while he tried to throw her off. Dante heard windows shattering as SWAT teams breached from multiple entry points, flashbangs filling the space with disorienting light and sound, tactical units pouring through with overwhelming force, and shouted commands to get down and show hands. He threw himself over Arya as she fell, his body a shield between her and the chaos, feeling her heart racing against his chest, and her breath hot on his neck, and the profound relief that she was alive. They were both alive. They'd survived again. Julian's soldiers surrendered, or were taken down with non-lethal force, professional efficiency dismantling the last remnants of Romano family resistance in under 60 seconds. But through the chaos, Dante saw his brother moving, saw Julian grab the fallen weapon and bring it up, not toward the federal agents, but toward Arya, toward the woman whose existence had destroyed everything Julian valued. Time slowed the way it does in crisis. Dante watching the gun track toward her head, seeing Julian's finger tighten on the trigger, knowing he was too far away to stop it. That after everything they'd survived, it would end with his brother's bullet finding her brain. But Vince was there, moving with precision born from 15 years of training, his own weapon firing 3 controlled shots that hit Julian's center mass. And Dante watched his brother fall with relief and grief, tangling into something that felt like the severing of bonds that should have meant more, but had been poisoned by his father's legacy. Julian hit the ground hard, blood blooming across his chest, and paramedics swarmed him, while Arya pulled Dante's face around to look at her instead of his dying brother, her hands on his cheeks forcing him to focus on her eyes instead of Julian's blood spreading across concrete. "I'm okay. We're okay. It's over," she repeated like a mantra. And he believed her because she was warm and solid and real in his arms, while federal agents secured the scene and his brother's life bled away, and the empire his father had built finally collapsed completely under the weight of its own corruption. Crawford appeared helping them both stand, checking for injuries with brisk efficiency, and Dante couldn't speak because all his words were caught behind too much emotion to process. Relief and grief and exhaustion and love all fighting for dominance in his chest. "Your brother won't make it," Crawford said quietly, clinical but not unkind. "The shots hit major arteries. He's got maybe minutes." The information should have triggered something, should have made Dante feel the complicated emotions of watching family die. But he felt only numbness, and the awareness that Julian had chosen this path, had died living the violent life their father had designed for them both. "I need to," Dante started, looking toward where paramedics were working frantically, feeling the pull of obligation or closure. But Arya's hand tightened on his arm. "No," she said firmly. "You don't owe him anything. Not your presence, not your forgiveness, not your grief. He tried to kill me twice, and would have succeeded today. Let him go, Dante. Choose me. Choose us. choose the future instead of staying chained to the past. She was right, had always been right, was offering him permission to walk away from the Romano legacy one final time, to close that chapter and begin something new. So Dante turned his back on his dying brother, on the family empire scattered in federal custody, on the name and legacy he'd carried for 34 years, and walked out of the meat processing plant, with Aria leaning against him, both of them battered and traumatized but alive, still together, still choosing each other despite everything that had tried to tear them apart. Outside the building, the morning sun was rising over Brooklyn, painting the sky in colors that looked like hope or new beginnings, and Dante breathed air that tasted like freedom for the first time in his life. Like the weight of his father's expectations had finally been lifted, and he could become whoever he chose to be, rather than who he'd been born to be. The trials took 4 months of testimony where Dante dismantled every aspect of the Romano criminal empire, piece by piece, watching men he'd known his entire life, sentenced to decades in federal prison for crimes he helped document and explain and contextualize for prosecutors who turned his cooperation into convictions. His mother attended Julian's funeral alone and looked at Dante across the cemetery like he was a stranger, like the son she'd raised had died along with his brother. And maybe he had. Maybe the old Dante Romano had burned away in that processing plant, and what remained was someone new, someone who valued truth over loyalty and love over legacy. Salvatore and the other captains glared at him from the defense table with the special hatred reserved for traitors. But Dante testified anyway because Aria was in the gallery, watching him choose her over everything. Because redemption required sacrifice. Because breaking the cycle of violence meant being willing to destroy what his grandfather and father had built, even if it made him the ultimate betrayer in their world. When the final verdict came down and the last captain was sentenced, Agent Crawford approached them in the courthouse hallway with documents that would end their old lives and begin new ones. Michael and Claire Bennett, Crawford said, handing over passports and social security cards and the paperwork that made them officially disappear from federal databases. Small town in Oregon, new identities, enough money to start over. You'll have a handler who checks in monthly for the first year. But after that, you're on your own, free to build whatever life you want, as long as you stay away from New York and anyone who knew you before. Dante, now Michael, looked at the passport photo showing a stranger's face with his eyes. Someone who didn't carry the weight of 3 generations of criminal legacy. Someone who got to choose what came next. Aria took his hand as they walked out of the courthouse into sunshine that felt like benediction, like forgiveness, like the universe offering them a second chance that most people never got. They'd survived fire and death and betrayal, had chosen each other when choosing anything else would have been easier, had walked through hell holding hands, and somehow made it to the other side still intact. "Ready?" she asked, and Dante squeezed her hand, feeling the scars on her palm that matched the scars on his soul, both of them marked by violence, but not defined by it. Both of them proof that people could change, could heal, could become better than their worst moments. "Ready?" he confirmed, and together they walked toward the car that would take them to the airport, to Oregon, to lives that were theirs alone to create, leaving behind the Romano name and everything it represented. The violence and legacy and curse that had almost destroyed them, but in the end had only made them stronger, had forged them in flames into people who understood exactly what love cost, and were willing to pay that price again and again, because some things were worth any sacrifice, and she was all of them. 6 months later, Dante stood on the porch of a modest house in Bend, Oregon, watching the sun set over the Cascade Mountains and marveling at how foreign peace felt after a lifetime of violence. How quiet mornings without fear of raids or retaliation or betrayal felt like living in a dream he might wake from at any moment. The house was small, 2 bedrooms, a workshop out back, a garden where Aria was attempting to grow tomatoes despite having no experience with anything that didn't involve survival or vengeance, and it was perfect in ways the Romano estate with its blood-soaked luxury had never been. They lived as Claire and Michael Bennett now, names that carried no weight or history, identities scrubbed clean of criminal legacy and federal cooperation, two people who officially didn't exist trying to figure out how to actually live instead of just survive. Dante had found work at a local construction company where his colleagues knew him as Mike, who was quiet and competent and didn't talk much about his past, who showed up on time and did good work and sometimes had nightmares. He blamed on military service he'd never actually had. Aria had returned to art restoration, working remotely for a Portland gallery that appreciated her skill with fire-damaged paintings and didn't ask questions about the gaps in her employment history. And watching her restore beauty from ash felt like witnessing her heal herself. Like every painting she saved was proof that destruction didn't have to be permanent. They were learning to be normal, learning what it felt like to grocery shop and pay bills and argue about whose turn it was to do dishes. All the mundane, beautiful, ordinary things that people who hadn't survived multiple murder attempts probably took for granted. The front door opened, and Araya emerged carrying 2 cups of coffee, her movements still slightly stiff on her left side, where burn scars pulled against muscle, permanent reminders of the night she'd been reborn in fire. She'd let her hair grow out some, and the black dye fade back to chestnut threaded with premature silver she refused to hide. Each gray strand a badge of survival earned through suffering she'd transformed into strength. She handed Dante a cup and settled into the chair beside his, their fingers intertwining automatically in the constant need for physical contact they'd both developed. Reassurance that the other was real and present and alive. "Vince called," she said, breaking the comfortable silence they'd learned to appreciate, after lives filled with chaos and noise. The appeals were all denied. Salvatore and the others are looking at spending the rest of their lives in federal prison with no possibility of parole. The news should have triggered guilt or regret, and maybe some small part of Dante felt those things, felt the weight of having destroyed men who'd been loyal to his family for decades. But mostly he felt relieved that it was truly finished, that the Romano Empire was dismantled beyond any possibility of resurrection. Vince had received immunity for his cooperation and relocated to the Midwest with his own new identity, but he called occasionally to check in with the cautious friendship of men who'd survived the same war and were trying to learn how to exist in peacetime. "How do you feel about it?" Aria asked, always giving him space to process the complicated emotions of having chosen her over everything he'd been raised to value. Dante considered the question, while watching mountains turn purple and gold in the fading light, tasting coffee that wasn't laced with anxiety about territory disputes, or family politics, or which soldier might decide to make a play for power. "I feel free," he said finally, the truth simple and profound. "For the first time in my life, I'm not my father's son, or the Romano heir, or the head of a criminal empire. I'm just a man who loves you, and that's enough. That's more than I ever thought I'd get to be." Aria's eyes filled with tears. She didn't bother hiding anymore. Emotional vulnerability, something they'd both had to relearn after years of armoring themselves against feeling too much. "I love you too," she said, the words still carrying weight, even after 6 months of saying them daily. "I love who you chose to become, that you walked away from everything for this, for us." They sat in silence as darkness settled, and stars emerged in the Oregon sky, more visible here than they'd ever been in New York, the universe revealing itself without the light pollution that had hidden it. "I have something to tell you," Aria said, nervous excitement in her voice that made Dante's heart kick with concern until he saw her expression carrying good news, rather than catastrophe for once. "I'm pregnant." The words reorganized his entire world around this new impossible gift. This chance to create life instead of taking it. To build a family defined by love rather than violence. To raise a child who would never know the Romano legacy or carry that weight. We're going to have a baby, Dante repeated, emotions overwhelming his capacity for speech, joy and terror, and gratitude tangling together into something too large to contain. Are you happy? Arya asked, vulnerability in the question, and he pulled her close, feeling her heart racing against his chest. I'm terrified and amazed and happier than I have any right to be, Dante admitted, his hand moving to rest on her still flat stomach over the beginning of new life. We're going to be good at this, right? We can raise a child who never knows violence, who grows up safe and loved. Arya covered his hand with hers, both their palms pressed against the future they were creating. We survived everything that should have killed us. We built this life from nothing. If we can do all that, we can absolutely raise a child who knows only love and safety, and the kind of normal we never got to have. The certainty in her voice made him believe it, made him think that maybe the cycle of Romano violence really was broken, that their child would get to grow up without the weight of criminal legacy or the expectation of becoming someone their father designed rather than someone they chose to be. Months turned into years in the small Oregon house where Dante and Arya became Michael and Claire, became parents to a daughter they named Hope, because that's what she represented, proof that redemption was possible, that love could survive attempted murder and federal investigations, and the systematic destruction of everything they'd known, that two broken people could heal together and build something beautiful from the ashes of their trauma. Dante coached Hope's soccer team and built furniture in his workshop and became someone his younger self wouldn't recognize, someone his father would have despised, someone he was proud to be. Arya restored paintings and taught Hope about color and creation, about building beauty instead of destroying it, about choosing love even when fear seemed safer. They had hard days when the past reached forward with phantom fingers, when nightmares surfaced and trauma demanded acknowledgement. But they weathered those storms together with the understanding that healing wasn't linear, that scars remained even after wounds closed, that surviving meant more than just staying alive. It meant learning to actually live with joy and purpose, and hope for futures that didn't include violence. On quiet evenings when Hope was asleep, and the house was peaceful, and mountains stood eternal against the sky, Dante and Arya would sit on their porch and remember everything they'd survived to get here, every choice that had led to this moment, every sacrifice that had purchased this peace. They'd hold hands and watch stars, and know with absolute certainty that burning down an empire to save each other had been worth it. That love had won not because it was easy, but because they'd both been willing to fight for it, to die for it, to live for it, even when living was harder than dying would have been. The Romano name faded from memory, reduced to footnotes in federal cases and true crime documentaries that would never tell the full story, would never understand that underneath the violence and betrayal was a love story about two people who'd been broken by the same family and had found wholeness in each other. And that story, their real story, lived on in the family they built, in the daughter they raised to be stronger and kinder and freer than either of them had been allowed to be, in the simple, profound miracle of getting to grow old together, of choosing each other every day, of building a life that was theirs alone, untainted by legacy or obligation or anything except the love that had survived fire and death, and 5 years of separation to bring them home to each other at last. Proof that even people born into darkness could find their way to light, if they were brave enough to walk away from everything and foolish enough to believe that love was worth any price, any sacrifice, any betrayal of the past for the possibility of a better future. After everything Dante and Arya endured, the violence, betrayal, and years of pain, they found peace by choosing love over legacy and truth over loyalty. If you had the chance to start completely over, to walk away from everything you've known for a shot at real happiness, would you take it? What would you be willing to leave behind? Share your thoughts below. And if this story moved you, let us know what moment hit you hardest.